So I'm watching Adam Friendon's Think Club argument, Think Club debate or discussion, does God exist? With what appears to be his friend Drew. And the first half hour of it, they start dealing with the variation of the Anselm argument for the existence of God, a highbrow philosophical argument. And it was really, really funny because Adam Friendon's response to it in real time on YouTube was almost identical to mine the first time I had heard of the argument, the first time I read the argument. Way back when I started on Twitter about 2 years ago, I didn't actually know who William Lane Craig was. I'm not even sure if I had heard of him. And I started looking into his website, Reasonable Faith, and I stumbled upon that particular argument. He has a version of it, the Anselm argument. And when I read it, my response was almost identical to Adam's. Huh? That's it? You're kidding, right? Is there an argument in here? You're kidding, right? This isn't really the argument, is it? Because to the untrained ear, which is me, which is Adam Friendon, the non-philosophical ear, it sounds like crazy talk. It sounds like crazy talk. Now, Drew offered that it's not a satisfying argument, and thank God that he did. Because as far as I'm concerned, Adam Friendon's objection, if the argument, the argument as framed is if you don't know it, you can look it up, Anselm's argument for the existence of God, or go watch the beginning of Think Club. Paul Gia also does a version where he debunks it. And Paul Gia debunks it along the same line that Adam debunked it right there in the YouTube. I can think of a unicorn that's greater than any unicorn I can think of, therefore the unicorn exists. You can plug in almost anything and get the same result. Paul Gia used a pizza. He thinks of a pizza, and I can conceive of no greater pizza than this greatest pizza that ever exists. Therefore, the pizza exists. And it's really hard to account for why they are wrong. Now, Drew tries to tell him why that's not true. And to the untrained ear, it sounds like special pleading. It sounds like because I say so, because it doesn't work like that, because I'm saying it's different for God. Different rules apply when you use the being of God. That's what it sounds like to the untrained ear. Now, to be fair to Drew, he said the argument isn't necessarily satisfying. What he did say is that it's sound and valid, and that it works in philosophy, and it needs to be defeated. I will listen to his version of it again. I'm not convinced that he gave a full accounting of why that was true, but I will give it a full hearing, and that's not really where I'm going with this. Because as far as I'm concerned, Adam's objection was completely 100% legit, so was Paul Gia's. Now, buried in the Anselm argument, here's why I stopped watching and started trying to make the video, is the beginning stages, the beginnings of a potentially really devastatingly powerful argument for the existence of God, case closed. The argument, as far as I'm concerned, is not successful as framed in either William Lane Craig's version of it or Drew's version of it. But Adam gave a meaningful objection that I think is really pertinent. He said, I'm an empiricist, meaning show me real world evidence or this is just crazy talk. And to the untrained ear, it sounds like crazy talk. Honestly, it really does. First time I heard the argument, I thought it was crazy talk. I was like, are you kidding? Are you literally kidding me? Because I imagine it thus, it's thus. That's what it sounds like the substance of the argument is. Now, I might be misinterpreting the argument. I'll give you that. But I'm going somewhere with this that has nothing ultimately to do with the argument. There is another version of it out there. Jonathan Pageau tries to update it. And he's got a video out there called Santa Claus is Real, where he tries to prove that Santa Claus actually exists along the same philosophical lines. Now, ultimately, his video is unsuccessful too. Starts to sound like crazy talk again. Starts to sound like crazy talk. It basically starts to amount to, it's so because I assert it so, and then anytime you try to counter it, just insert any form of special pleading you want to insert. But I'm going somewhere with this because it is not that dissimilar from the beginnings of an argument that I'm trying to work on. Some of my other videos I've argued in the past. There is such a place in reality where an empiricist like Adam Friendon and a super spiritual person like Marianna Williamson, okay, those are two sides of the spectrum. You got a super spiritual person like a Craig Reed or Marianna Williamson, or an empiricist, show me the facts person like an Adam Friended or any other atheist. There is a place where the subjective and the objective meet in reality, as I point out in some of my other videos. For example, if I go into my prayer closet and I have a subjective experience that I am establishing for myself, peace of mind, then I objectively experience some measure of more peace of mind. Just by virtue of its subjective reality, it exists. Now, think about these next couple of things that I'm going to talk about. And if you're an atheist, chill. This is just me throwing out ideas to show you that there is potentially a really good argument buried in here. This isn't the argument in and of itself. This is more like notes, okay? So chill. You don't got to debunk everything. Take your little debunk hat off. Just relax. Now, it occurred to me, money, for example. So we're batting around the concept where subjective, spiritual, and objective reality meet somewhere in reality. I believe it thus it's thus. Money, for example, is a fiction. Did you know that? Did you know that? Money is a fiction. Yes, it's a fiction that we collectively agree upon as a society, but it's a fiction nonetheless. Money has no intrinsic value whatsoever. Originally, money was a bank note, denoting, so you would go to a bank, you had one piece of currency, and they would give you one piece of gold in exchange for your one piece of currency. So it had an actual real-world substantive exchange rate. Those days have long since gone. And if you talk about in terms of global, in America, we went off the gold standard sometime in the late 60s, early 70s, the Nixon administration. Nixon took us off the gold standard. So there's nothing officially backing our currency. So in essence, it is a fiction. It is a fantasy. It is a fantasy that we as a society mutually agree upon, denoting some exchange rate value that we mutually agree upon. Now, keep in mind, I'm just going somewhere with this. If you know classical economics, you probably already understand why this isn't exactly true. I'm just going somewhere with it. Just bear this all in mind. Take this all with a grain of salt. So money is a mutually agreed upon fiction. For example, in Weimar, Germany, the bottom fell out of, they had runaway inflation, so all of a sudden money was effectively worthless. And you had to bring a wheelbarrow full of money to buy a loaf of bread. And in the real world terms, people today in real world economics, people have accused China, for example, of on purpose devaluing its currency, making its money worth a little less than its actual exchange rate. Why? To undercut price, so they could sell goods for cheaper. Mitt Romney was throwing that around back in when he was running for president. That's a real accusation launched against China, that they have on purpose devalued their currency. Money has no intrinsic value whatsoever. It has agreed upon representational value, symbolic value. And that symbolic value, by virtue of the fact that we all agree upon it, has actual real world value. And if you don't believe me, give me your money. Yeah, it's a fantasy. But it's a fantasy that we buy into so thoroughly that, if you actually think it's a fantasy, send me all your money. I'll take it off your hands. I will disabuse you of that illusion. Now, again, take it all with a grain of salt, because if you understand classic economics, you're already arguing with me. Because there is such a thing as a law, a what? A law of supply and demand. And money is actually the representation of that law. So let's say in my little closet here, I build a really cool thing. Okay? And I go to trade it with people. The supply, how much people are going to be willing to give me for it, represents a perfect relationship between supply and demand. If people really, really want my cool thing, they're going to give me a lot for it. If they only kind of like my cool thing, they're going to give me less. They think it's kind of cool, this thing I built, they'll give me 100 exchange units. They think it's really out there, that thing is just way cool, gotta have it, and people are fighting for it, then I can basically set its price. Its value is not intrinsic. Its value represents a relationship to what? To the law of supply and demand. This is a basic law of economics. So there is a reality that money is predicated on, and that is the law. It's getting complicated. Okay, now, Just keep this in mind as I shift to another real world example where something subjective value, okay, this is what we're exploring. Its subjective interpretation of its value actually produces some tangible, real world, empirically verifiable difference. Say you go to an antique store today and you buy a guitar. You buy it for $500. You think it looks cool. Then lo and behold, you take it home and let's just say for argument's sake, you found out it was Elvis Presley's guitar. And you can prove it. There's documentation that proves it. And I don't know if any of you watch these shows like Pawn Stars. I used to watch Pawn Stars all the time. It's actually really cool, really interesting show. But there's a thing that they do, I think it's called Progeny. I forget the exact name. Antiques Roadshow was like the PBS version. Also a good show where if you could establish, if you could document, if I could prove that this guitar was in fact owned by Elvis Presley, that I bought for $500, what has the real world value of that guitar has actually skyrocketed? And I could prove it. Let's just say for argument's sake that I established the progeny and I could prove it. I think I'm using those terms correctly. I'm not certain. It's been a long time since I watched those shows. Cool show, by the way. Pawn Stars is actually a really cool show. So, what happens to the actual real world value of the guitar? I could probably sell it for $50,000, right? Honestly, if it were really a guitar that was owned by Elvis Presley and I could prove that, I could probably get somebody to pay $50,000 for it. So, by virtue of kind of a mystical association, an unreal association in terms of an empiricist. Now, let's take an empiricist like Adam Friended or Deconverted Man. Is Deconverted Man going to pay any more than $500 for the guitar? No. Why? Because he's going to say, well, it hasn't changed any material substance about the guitar itself. So what if it was owned by Elvis Presley? The guitar is still the exact same guitar. In real world empirical terms, nothing has changed. Its value has skyrocketed in terms of what? In terms of how we perceive this real world item. It has achieved iconographic status. Some type of mystical, okay? This is where it gets interesting. Because the reason why most people would pay a lot for it, and its value has actually skyrocketed in real world terms. Adam, the empiricist, could count the difference between $500 that I paid for it and the $50,000 that I'm not asking for it. That's a real world, empirically verifiable change in its subjective status, you want to call it, its subjective value, I don't know, whatever you want to call that. All I'm trying to point out is the reason that happens is that most people are more super spiritual like me than they are super rational like Deconverted Man. The reason why most people would pay more for that guitar is because they kind of think the fact that Elvis Presley owned it imbues it with some sort of pseudo-mystical power. And depending on where you rank on the super spiritual scale, you might actually believe it has real power. I bet you $1,000 there's at least 30% of the people listening to this video who would put it in their apartment and think it's giving them songwriting abilities, think it's giving them musical prowess, think it's imbuing them with some type of sacred characteristics. That's why the value skyrockets. Because we have a mystical association in our mind. There's no real world tangible difference to a guitar that I bought in an antique store that wasn't owned by Elvis Presley, and then you find out it was owned by Elvis Presley. No, nothing has shifted in the actual material substance of the guitar, but people's interpretation of its value has done a complete 360. Hence, its real world value has escalated. So there is a place here. Now, how does this tie into the Anselm argument? Well, that's where it gets really complicated. I'm not exactly sure how to tie this in. What I'm trying to point out is that there is some form of reality to the symbolic imbuing of significance, its iconographic status. There are differences in how people are going to believe what it can now do. All the way from the Marianna Williamson, who probably thinks if she puts it up in her room, she'll probably pray to it. And probably thinks that if she were to write songs, she'd pray to it. And go, give me songwriting power, let me be. She tried to channel Elvis Presley while she was writing her song. I promise you, there's a lot of people who do something like that. Think it has real world mystical powers. To someone like Deconverted Man, who's only thinking logically, rationally, Wouldn't pay an extra cent for it. I don't know where Adam Friend would be on that spectrum. He'd be closer to the mainstream of human opinion would be somewhere in the middle. No, it's probably not going to give me songwriting powers, but wow, would that be cool to have in my apartment? Maybe it's giving you nothing more than bragging rights. That guitar was owned by Elvis Presley. The point is something has actually changed. A spiritual change. And this is related to the Anselm argument. A spiritual change, a mystical change, a change that is completely and utterly subjective, has no material substance at all. It's as spiritual as it can be. It was owned by someone who is no longer alive, who's famous for songwriting, would actually make a real world change in its status as an item. Now, it wouldn't affect any of its material substance at all. This is where there's the germ of the beginning of a really powerful argument buried in this Anselm, what effectively is gobbledygook. Like I said, take everything I just said with a grain of salt, because I'm just throwing out the concepts. I didn't create an argument here. There's no argument being made. I'm just saying, think about those things, because somewhere buried in there is a really, 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 really devastatingly powerful argument for the existence of God. I promise. That's all, kids. That's all for now, kids. Yes, Elvis Presley guitars. Yeah, what's someone weird with that whole thing? But there's a reason why I did it. It's related to the Anselm argument more than you may think. Because the Anselm argument is predicated on the idea, and it's more obvious if you listen to the Jonathan Pageau version of it, that our symbolic ideas about things have tangible material substance somehow. Now, I kind of proved it with the guitar. Kind of proved it. Kind of, sort of. So, it's related. And expect more videos on this subject in times to come. But, again, as it's framed by Drew, I'm totally with Adam. I think it's basically crazy talk. It's not an argument for the existence of God. It just sounds like a string of wild assertions. And I can't for the life of me. I'll go back and listen to Drew, because he seems like he's a legitimate philosopher and his grasp on it was pretty straightforward. So maybe he can make it clear to me how it's even why even I was reading about in William Lane Craig's Arsenal, because when I read it, I started laughing. And as far as I'm concerned, Paul's take on it was 100% legitimate. Paul said, I can imagine a pizza, the greatest pizza that ever was. So I went into my little sideshow diatribe on money as fiction, money as symbolic representation. There is a place where symbolic power, this is how this is related, is the only way. And it's really related, trust me on this. There is a place where symbolic power has real world significance. There is a place where subjective reality has real world, empirically verifiable reality, objectively verifiable reality. Where Marianne Williamson and Adam Friend meet in the middle. Where she says this is all mystical gooey, and he translates it into real world, achievable, tangible ideas. Money is close to that. That's my point. That's why I brought up money. Money is close to that. It is close to a fiction that we all agree upon. Hence, it has actual real-world symbolic power and value. Real-world symbolic power. A lot of it. So, I'm not 100% sure that was all clear, but, whatever. It's a YouTube video. Take it with a grain of salt. Just throwing out ideas. It's just a YouTube video. So, everybody take a chill. You could still be an atheist. I didn't prove that God exists. Just wasn't trying to. Just throwing out some ideas where I think there's actually a really good argument buried in there somewhere. And that's where the potentially really good argument is. There is a relationship between subjective symbolic reality, spiritual reality, what we the spiritual people. I am somewhere in the middle of Marianne Williamson, for example, and a neutral party. I would pay a lot for the Elvis guitar. And I might convince myself that it's helping me somehow in my musical prowess, in my songwriting ability. I might. And by virtue of the fact that I might convince myself that it's helping me, might it actually be helping me? Sure. Yeah, that's the point. Yeah. If I start to become convinced that it's imbuing me with songwriting ability, am I going to maybe start to write better songs just by virtue of the fact that I'm more confident in my ability by a little bit because I got a cool Elvis guitar hanging in my room when I write? Sure, yes. Totemic value. Totemic iconographic status has some real-world translatability. That's my point. Yes, I might actually become a little bit better of a songwriter by virtue of the fact that I got a cool Elvis guitar that's giving me inspiration, making me think I'm a little better of a songwriter. See what I'm saying? I don't know. Maybe it was, all right, fine, whatever, fine, then stay an atheist. I don't care. I don't care, then stay an atheist, whatever. That is all for now, kids. Amen.